interrupt this program for a CBS Radio Net Alert Bulletin.
This is Alan Jackson reporting from CBS News headquarters in New York with a bulletin on an incident which just occurred in Dallas, Texas, where President Kennedy is visiting. President Kennedy and Governor John Connally of Texas were both hit by a would-be assassin's bullet as they toured downtown Dallas in an open automobile a short while ago. That is the latest word that has just come in from Dallas on United Press International. The Associated Press, in its first report, says that President Kennedy was shot just as his motorcade left downtown Dallas. Mrs. Kennedy, who was riding with him, jumped up and grabbed Mr. Kennedy and cried, "Oh, no." The motorcade sped on. Riding in the same car with the president for this particular motorcade was Governor and Mrs. John B. Connally, the governor of the state of Texas. According to the last report, both the president and the governor were hit by the bullets.
November the 22nd, 1963, the day President John Fitzgerald Kennedy was assassinated. We look back upon that day 50 years later. Welcome to Galaxy Moonbeam Night Site. We are the retro talk program for nostalgia and baby boomer stuff. I'm Smitty.
I'm Mike.
On this episode of Galaxy Moonbeam Night Site, we look back to that tragic day in Dallas 50 years ago and the assassination of President Kennedy. How the nation and the world changed that day, how some remember where they were and what they were doing when they received the news, and how today, 50 years later, this tragic event still is of great interest and is spoken of often.
And during this segment, we will be listening to extensive radio coverage from that day, as was heard on CBS. From the moment the first bulletin was received, as you heard it at the opening of our show, to the notification that the president had died. We will be hearing from several of our past guests and friends who have recollections of that day and of the sad weekend and weeks to follow.
We'll also talk about how the world would have been different if President Kennedy had lived. Indeed, how might our nation and world be different today had the president lived? One thing we will just touch upon but not get into is the number of conspiracy theories that abound. From the moment of the president's death to even this year, conspiracy theories have existed and have helped to shroud the assassination in mystery and intrigue.
All of this and more on this one-hour episode of Galaxy Moonbeam Night Site.
The death of President Kennedy is remembered by all who were alive and who were of reasoning age at that time. It's a deeply personal memory for so many. No matter what side of the political spectrum you were on or are on, this tragic and heartbreaking event stirs up deep memories for many. Mike, we mentioned that we would be hearing personal memories throughout our program, and I would like to begin with your recollections of that day. I don't have any recollections since I was just an infant and less than a year old, but you were a schoolboy in Southern California. What do you remember about where you were when you heard the news and what you recall of going home and spending that night with your family?
Well, Smitty, like you say, I was a schoolboy. I was 10 years old, and I attended a elementary school in Los Angeles in the northeast area of L.A. I remember out on the playground. It was a little in the early afternoon, I believe, and I remember that an administrator, the lady who ran the office in the school, came out and told all the kids, go to your classrooms, the president has been shot. And that's what I remember as clear as if it was last week. The president has been shot. And I thought she said the president had been shocked. And I thought, shocked? It had no way of registering in my 10-year-old mind. And then I looked over and I saw a couple of teachers coming out, and they were in tears. They were weeping. So the kids in my class, my friends and I, we went back upstairs to our classroom. And you always remember certain teachers.
Right.
And this teacher, this fellow, Mr. Hamilton, was a guy I remember as a serious guy. He had served in World War II. He was a very strong disciplinarian, very military-like, and he was sitting with his face in his hands at his desk at the front of the table, and he was crying. And again, I could not calculate what was going on watching this big, tough John Wayne kind of guy crying. And then I remember in my modality, my audio modalities, every classroom had a radio, a big old Bakelite Philco radio
Right.
that was standard issue for LA Unified School District classrooms. And on that radio, I believe it was CBS. And they kept going in and out as bulletins. And then we heard one of the correspondents report from Dallas, Texas, where President John F. Kennedy has been seriously injured in a shooting, I believe they called it. And just the level of shock, even in a 10-year-old's mind, when something hits you like that, the unexpected, you're trying to sort out and trying to put a picture in your mind of what's going on. And around that time, the decision was made to send all the school kids home about an hour early. Mm-hmm. So we walked home, and I lived about 6 blocks away from the school. I remember walking up Avenue 51, and we crossed the main shopping area, York Boulevard. My brother and I could see people on the sidewalk, and they were weeping. And people were gathered around. There was a 76 Union gas station, Don's 76, on the corner. The radio was blaring, and people were all facing the radio. And they looked pale. They looked in shock, as I remember. And still, 10 years old, I'd never been face-to-face with a horrible tragedy such as that, or any catastrophe for that matter, and continued on home and got in the door, and my mom had the TV on, the black and white, in the dining room. And I remember seeing Walter Cronkite, and I remember his horn-rimmed glasses, and he was trying to piece together the story, and they were feeding telephonic reports, minute-by-minute accounts. And it's interesting how 50 years later, even in the mind of a 10-year-old, fast forward today in the mind of a 60-year-old, how clear that afternoon was to me. How clear, but at the same time, how confusing. The illusion you put in your mind trying to piece together factual information and put it together a story, Dallas, that's in Texas. And again, Buchanan Street School was an elementary school with blue-collar, hardworking families sent their kids. But Kennedy was a hero figure. I don't think there was a home in Highland Park, the community I lived in, that didn't have a picture of Kennedy on the wall. Mm-hmm. And Kennedy, he was a hero figure, the President Kennedy. Mm-hmm. I remember a story about Kennedy that probably happened 2 months before, at the start of the school year. Somebody had set a mailbox on fire around the corner from my house. And the fire trucks came, and they put the fire out in the mailbox, and there was a police officer there, and he was asking everybody, and my brother and I were standing around, and he come over to us, and he goes, "You fellas have any idea who could have done this?" Well, no, we don't have any idea. We heard the sirens and came down here, and somebody lit the mailbox, the postal box, the letterbox on fire, and he goes, "Well, that is a very serious offense. That's President Kennedy's personal cabinet there." And I remember how clear that police officer told me that's President Kennedy's property. That's not to be messed with.
Wow.
So if you know anything, you call the station. Right. That's how effective and how important and how much impact the president had. And this was in a time where you may not have voted for President Kennedy. You may have been far from agreeing with his politics, but there was respect for the office. Even my dad, my dad was a Republican, and he was not a Kennedy fan. But he praised Kennedy because he said he's a warrior, he's a veteran. And I remember my dad sitting at the dinner table having arguments with my uncle, who was a Democrat, and saying, "One thing I'll have to give you is the guy believes in what he does. Right. He's not your typical politician. He believes his heart, so I got to give him that."
Well, that was a different time, Mike, and I think there was a lot more reverence to our leaders at that time. And we're not a political show by any stretch of the imagination, but I'll go out on a soapbox and say that at that time our leaders deserved that kind of respect. And one thing in listening to the old recordings, of the reactions and the reports from that time period, because as there are a lot of recordings. We've heard some earlier here in our show, and we have some more that we're going to play here in just a few minutes. That seemed to be the general theme that I picked up, is respect for the president, respect for President Kennedy. That seemed to be a universal thing that you heard that day by people who were sharing their reactions.
And whether or not you were a Kennedy fan, if you believed in JFK's politics or not, we all as Americans, we felt robbed. We felt robbed of our president. Many of us felt robbed of our hero, that he was taken away by somebody very, very evil and very, very bad. And as you mentioned earlier in the show, Smitty, there are conspiracy theories to this very day, and 50 years after you and I are gone, there will still be conspiracy theories. We may not ever know the truth, or the truth that we've been told may be, in fact, the truth, which leads to some of the mystique. But say what you will, the 60s, we were on the verge of getting ourselves into yet another war. JFK had just gotten out of the other end of the Bay of Pigs controversy, and there was a lot going on. It was a tumultuous time. 1960s in America was a turning point. in our society for so many different reasons, and we've talked about so many of those reasons and so many of those issues in past shows. But, the common thread is probably anybody who was 10 years old or older during that time has a Kennedy story and a Kennedy remembrance, and we have some of our guests and some of our good friends who took the time to share with us some of the important moments in their minds surrounding that day, that fateful day.
We're going to be hearing some of those in just a moment. We've asked them to share their memories. We wanted to begin with Mike because he's here with us who are listening, and we wanted to get his take on it first. But we're going to go to the another one of the radio bulletins here in just a second. We talked about the media coverage on that day. Radio covered the story as it broke, as well as television. In television's case, of course, its lack of mobility and non-immediacy as compared to radio was a handicap. Both NBC and ABC TV struggled to get picture and sound circuits to function, and indeed ABC did not even have a studio ready to go on the air. The chaotic efforts mirrored the confusion felt by millions around the country. Over at CBS TV, there was more organization, and the story began to be told. Radio, as we said, because of its immediacy, gave the fastest account of what had happened, and indeed what was happening. And we'll be listening to some extensive clips on the CBS radio coverage of the first moments of that tragic day. You've already heard the first bulletin, but let's listen now to the second bulletin as it came over CBS Radio.
This is Alan Jackson reporting from CBS News headquarters in New York with more details on the incident which just occurred in Dallas a short while ago, where President Kennedy has been wounded by a would-be assassin. He and Texas Governor Connolly were shot from ambush as their motorcade drove through Dallas shortly after the president arrived in the city on the second day of his tour. So far, there is no indication of how seriously either man was injured. Both were lying flat in their car as the automobile sped off to a hospital. Both men have been taken to the Park Lane Hospital in Dallas for treatment. The incident occurred just east of the Triple Underpass facing a park in downtown Dallas. Reporters in the motorcade with the presidential party were about 5 car lengths behind the chief executive's car at the time. Secret Service agents in a follow-up car quickly unlimbered their automatic rifles. They drew their pistols, but the damage had been done. We will be getting additional details from minute to minute as we continue here. The shooting took place at 1:45 Eastern Time. That was just about a little over 10 minutes ago. President Kennedy apparently was shot in the head. He fell face down in the back seat of his car, and there was blood on his head. Both the president and the governor were rushed to Parkland Hospital near the Dallas Trade Mart, where President Kennedy was to have made a speech today. As you know, this was the middle day of his 3-day tour of Texas. And a late word, Texas Congressman Albert Thomas says he has been informed that both President Kennedy and Governor Connolly are still alive after having been shot in an assassination attempt. That is the first word we have had to that effect. Congressman Thomas says he has been informed that President Kennedy and Governor Connolly are both still alive after the shooting attempt a short while ago. He has been told the president is still alive but is in a very critical condition. President Kennedy is in a very critical condition after the attempted assassination in Dallas, Texas, less than a quarter of an hour ago. When the president was taken into the emergency room, a call was sent out immediately for some of the top surgical specialists in Dallas. And a call was also sent out for a Roman Catholic priest. This is a standard procedure in serious operations of this type and is not to be taken as indicating the expected fate of the president yet. Congressman Jim Wright of Fort Worth says that both men were seriously wounded in the shooting, but that they are alive. So there we have the situation as it exists at the present time. Assassins attempted to shoot and kill the President of the United States and the Governor of Texas a short while ago as the presidential motorcade drove through downtown Dallas shortly after the presidential party arrived in that city. The president and his wife and the governor and his wife were both riding in the same car, the lead limousine of their motorcade, going to the Dallas Trade Mart where the president was to have made a speech. So this situation has dramatically brought the news that the president is in critical condition, seriously wounded, and so is the governor, but both men are alive and being given treatment in the emergency ward of the Parkland Hospital in Dallas. And we are awaiting further details and further information on the condition of the men and on the possible apprehension of the would-be assassins. We have had 2 reports that Secret Service men are surrounding a building where it is believed the would-be assassins are holed up on the 5th floor. We have a further report from another one of our correspondents in the area. Let's go now to news correspondent Nelson Benton at the hospital.
A few moments ago, there was still no official word on the president's condition from authorities at Dallas Parkland Memorial Hospital. However, Senator Ralph Yarborough of Texas, who was riding 3 cars behind the president in the Dallas motorcade, gave reporters a description of what he saw as the president was shot and as his car followed the presidential limousine from downtown Dallas to the hospital. Senator Yarborough told newsmen that he heard 3 shots. He did not see where they came from, but he thought he heard 3. He said he then saw a Secret Service man beating his fist on the president's limousine. Senator Yarborough told newsmen it was too horrible to describe, but he did tell reporters that both Governor Connolly and the president were gravely injured. He said that the president appeared to have been shot in the head. Thus far, no report, as we know from here, on his exact condition. This is Nelson Benton outside Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas, Texas.
One further report has come into our news headquarters here in New York by the Associated Press, quoting the Secret Service as saying that the president remains in the emergency room and that the governor has been moved to the general operating room of Parkland Hospital. One Secret Service man was overheard telling another that there was no need to move the president because emergency facilities are entirely adequate in the emergency room where he is located. We have a report now from one more of our correspondents on the scene. Our White House correspondent who was accompanying the president here is CBS News correspondent Robert Pierpoint in Dallas.
President Kennedy's condition here at Parkland Memorial Hospital is apparently quite serious. 2 priests reportedly have just gone in to be with the president, and according to Senator Ralph Yarborough, who was in the motorcade, the president's condition is serious. This is Robert Pierpoint at Parkland Memorial Hospital.
Our news bureau in Washington has reported that the Senate has recessed and that Senator Ted Kennedy, the youngest of the Kennedy brothers, was presiding over the Senate when the news was received. Kennedy, according to a member of his staff, was still alive as of 12:55 p.m. Central Standard Time, that is, as of 10 minutes ago. Mrs. Kennedy apparently was safe, and Mrs. Connolly also is safe. Both women were riding in the same car, the same limousine, in which the president and the governor were riding in the motorcade through Dallas when the assassination attempt took place. But as we have heard from correspondent Pierpoint, the president's condition apparently is serious. A call has gone out for specialists, and 2 Catholic priests have been summoned to be with the president in this moment. And while we are waiting for further details to come in from Dallas, here is my colleague, Dallas Townsend, with a summary on similar situations in the past. Dallas Townsend.
Well, Alan, the most famous assassination in American history, of course, was the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president of the United States, who was shot by John Wilkes Booth in April 1865 and died the following day. After that, there was an attempt on William McKinley, who was president in 1901. William McKinley was shot on September 6, 1901, and he died September 14th after lingering for several days in extreme pain. An anarchist named Leon Czolgosz was executed for the crime on October 29th. In 1933, President-elect Franklin Delano Roosevelt was shot at in Miami, Florida, by an anarchist named Joseph Zangara. The anarchist missed the president-elect, but fatally wounded Mayor Anton Cermak of Chicago. Mayor Cermak died March 6th. Zangara was electrocuted on March 20th, 1933, just about the time that Roosevelt was inaugurated president. When President Truman was in the White House, actually he was in Blair House at the time, there was an attempt on his life by Puerto Rican super-nationalists who attacked Blair House in the early afternoon, fired at the Secret Service, and actually shot and killed one of the Secret Service guards. The president was on the third floor of Blair House at the time. As I recall, he came to the window. One of the Secret Service guards looked up, saw him, and said, "Get back, Mr. President," and he got back. The president was not injured in that incident. Since that time, there have been no known attacks on the president until the one today in Dallas, Texas, against President Kennedy and Governor John Connally. And as Alan Jackson has been telling you, they are critically injured but are still alive at the moment, both of them in hospital. Alan?
We have more information now from our correspondents on the scene. Let's switch to Dan Rather.
Dallas police and federal agents have completely surrounded a multi-story building which was on the motorcade route directly across the street from the scene where President John Kennedy and Texas Governor John Connally were shot a short while ago. Police say they have found 4 empty cartridges on the 5th floor of the building. Police with sawed-off shotguns and other weapons have completely ringed the entire area. One ring of police is around the building itself. Another is around about a 3-block area in which the building is located. Police and federal agents are going through a systematic search of the building. Police emphasize that they have no definite information as yet as to whether the empty cartridges found in the building were those fired from the gun which hit President Kennedy and Governor Connally. But police are working on the theory that the would-be assassin fired his shots from that 5-story building, which was on the motorcade route directly across the street from where President Kennedy and Governor Connally were shot. This is Dan Rather in Dallas, Texas.
President Kennedy and Governor Connally injured in an assassination attempt in Dallas about a half an hour ago. And President Kennedy has been given blood transfusions. Governor Connally, we were told a few moments ago, was taken from the emergency ward into the operating room. We are told that the president's condition is serious. We are not told of any details about his condition. The shooting occurred a short time after the presidential party arrived in Dallas. And as we have heard from correspondent Rather, apparently it took place from the 5th floor of a downtown office building where police and security agents have now found 4 spent cartridges, presumably those that were used in the assassination attempt. The building has been surrounded. We do not have any word on whether any people have been apprehended and linked directly with the shooting yet. Here in New York, the New York stock exchanges have closed early for the day because of the shooting of President Kennedy. In Washington, the Senate recessed pending developments as word reached the Capitol there that the president had been shot in Dallas. The House was not in session at the time. Senator Mansfield, the Democratic leader, made the motion to recess at 4 minutes before 2 Eastern Time. Senator Wayne Morris of Oregon said just before the recess, if there ever was an hour when all Americans should pray, this is the hour. We are gathering details on a tragic story that has occurred in today's American history, where the President of the United States and the Governor of the state of Texas have been shot and seriously wounded, apparently, in an assassination attempt in downtown Dallas. Let's switch now for news from the nation's capital as we switch to news correspondent Wells Church on Capitol Hill.
Well, of course, Washington was probably hardest hit by this startling news. And oddly enough, by coincidence, the president's brother, Senator Ted Kennedy, was the presiding officer of the Senate when they learned of the shooting. Actually, he was calmly signing his name to a series of group photographs for visitors when an aide came running in with the word from Dallas. Well, most of the senators looked up, of course, obviously angry at the interruption, and the aide ran to Kennedy's chair. The senator threw down his pen, and the pictures scattered all over as he ran for the door. And the same aide ran from senator to senator telling them the news. They'd just been discussing the proposed extension of aid to rural libraries.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States is dead. John F. Kennedy has died of the wounds received in an assassination in Dallas less than an hour ago. We repeat, it has just been announced that President Kennedy is dead.
Well, that was the second bulletin, of course, announcing the death of President Kennedy. You heard Alan Jackson there. Mike, as I was listening to that, I was thinking about what was going on around the nation at that moment. I suppose people who were listening, they must have been going through the full gamut of emotions.
The emotions and society in general, Smitty, took a quick exit off of the usual day-to-day. I remember my favorite station in L.A. was KFWB. They weren't playing rock and roll radio. They were playing classical music in between cut-ins of the bulletins. Television, there weren't a lot of stations. You had, in Los Angeles, you had 4 or 5 operating stations. They were all going live. Stores were closing. People had closed. The liquor stores were all closed. And this is upon the announcement that President Kennedy, in fact, was dead. The movie theaters, lights out. Broadway in New York, lights out. And this was not just that evening of the notice. It was, I believe, up to almost a week afterwards. People, neighbors who hadn't talked to each other were on their porches and out in the front. And a lot of it, they were venting and they were expressing and they had to talk to somebody. It was still at the stage where it was totally unbelievable. I guess America as a society was in total shock.
I think that we need to place ourselves back. Those of you who are old enough to remember that event, you could easily place yourself back at that time period. But to those of us who are a little younger, America was a different place. It was a different... This did not happen. This sort of a thing did not happen. It had been, 62 years since a presidential assassination. William McKinley was the last president to be assassinated. Of course, Presidents Harding and Roosevelt had died in office, but they had died of natural causes. But this did not happen in post-World War II, 1963 America. The President of the United States did not get assassinated.
No, and the very medium that we talked about in previous shows, Smitty, the very medium that got John F. Kennedy elected as president, that being television, was the same media that transformed JFK into a larger-than-life, almost a pop culture figure. You know, just a few months before the assassination in June of '63, a movie came out starring Cliff Robertson, and the movie is called PT 109. And it was a depiction, of course, it was a Hollywood depiction of JFK, but it was historically, factually correct. And what it did in that movie is show JFK as this very rich young man, a young man with privilege, a young man with very powerful parents, a very powerful family, who could get whatever he wants. And you think in the middle of a war, a horrible war, this guy would be finding ways to get out of the action and go hide and go rowboating outside of Harvard, but not JFK, and it even spoke to that in the movie. JFK begged his father, Joe Kennedy, begged him to let him get in and get into the action in the South Pacific. And JFK was a young ensign, junior grade, and he begged his father, and his father would have none of it. And as we know in history, some of the history buffs will know the Kennedy family, Joe Kennedy was killed in World War II.
Absolutely.
So JFK got his way. He wanted to go out and he wanted to serve and be in the action. And action he did to that very dark night in PT 109, which was a beat-up old PT boat that they assigned him to, hoping he would stay out of trouble so the commanding officers wouldn't have to go answer to Joe Kennedy if something happened to his kid. And here comes this Japanese destroyer that literally cut the PT boat in half.
Right.
And this courageous young junior lieutenant, junior grade, swam out with a back injury. 2 of the crew members were killed, and as the leader of the boat, JFK went out and found the guys who were floating adrift and got them all together. And that was addressed in that movie. Mm-hmm. And that movie really touched me because I like that kind of movie anyway, but It said, wow, this is our president. He actually fought in the war. But this was very real, and you had this young, stunning, good-looking guy who's the president, a war hero. They exhaustively televised stories about Camelot and about the Kennedy family and Jackie Kennedy, and we got to meet his kids.
Right.
You know, John, and Caroline, and we felt they were an extension of our own family. And I think that's the shock. It would be almost as if your Uncle Phil keeled over with a heart attack or didn't make it home on the commute on the freeway. That was the shock we keep going back to, the shock of having someone taken away that was there yesterday, and tonight they're not there.
I think that's part of it, Mike, is that President Kennedy was a young man. He was less than 50 years old. He was a vigorous man, and he had young children, and he had a young wife, and he was in the prime of life. And I think for his life to be snuffed out in a second like that, I'm sure that a lot of people felt a personal connection with him losing his life so suddenly. You know, Mike, the other thing that I'm thinking about is that I can equate, I think, probably the people that were like yourself that do remember that. For an earlier generation, that would have been the people that heard the news on the radio of Pearl Harbor, a sudden attack by the Japanese, or 4 years later, the death of President Roosevelt. An earlier generation had experienced that. Later generations, I remember very well the day that the shuttle Challenger exploded in 1986, I believe it was. And that was a shock. And, of course, all of us remember 9/11. It's one of those watershed moments that you remember exactly what you were doing, exactly where you were. And I think in President Kennedy's case, there was that emotional connection, that feeling that he was a member of your family. He was your big brother or your uncle or, you know, someone that you really cared about.
And we look to him, like you say, Smitty, as a role model, and he was also the president. Now, think what that means. It means a whole lot different today, unfortunately,
yes.
And we are not a political show. We can get away with being politically incorrect, but correctness has nothing to do with the fact that when you referred to President John F. Kennedy in 1963, it was a different feeling, a different respect, a different honor to behold than referring to our leaders of our government today, and that's just because of the winds of time have changed in society. But he was the leader of the country. He was the president. He was one to be respected. You talked about the president with reverence, even if you disagreed with him. And even with the documentaries to this day, talk about the popularity of the guy. The popularity, there was a documentary I saw recently, Smitty, on KPBS here in San Diego, where he went back and visited Ireland. And you think he was popular here. He went back to Ireland. He was beyond a cult figure. He was a world leader, and he had him coming out of the woodwork. He was a cousin that went over to America and made good.
And made good, exactly.
But that was the world charm. We talk about his I'm a Berliner speech at the Wall.
The Berlin Wall, exactly.
He lit up the room. There are some people who take oxygen out of the room, and there are other people who not only light the room, but they feed pure O2 into the room.
Yes.
And he was one of them. I would have loved to have had the honor to have met him.
I think the other thing, Mike, that his manner of expressing himself, of course, his inaugural address, many of the speeches that he made, he expressed himself very clearly and expressed an underlying faith in America, and also a belief in God, that God was watching over us, that we were truly a nation under God. And I think that you listen to President Kennedy's speeches today, and all of us find that very inspiring.
Well, he seemed a humble man with all of the riches and all of the privilege. You just don't think of JFK as the guy who would stand in front of the mirror and look at his reflection all day. Even when he took the rap for Bay of Pigs going bad. Yeah, he took the rap. He didn't have a staff of people that he pinned. He took it, and he took it like a man. And again, he just seemed like an agreeable guy to know. We've got some folks that we've worked with, some guests, some good friends who remember that day and those times. Dave Leonard, who was recently on the show with our four-part series on Top 40 San Diego Radio, he had some interesting recollections, Smitty. Do we have a tape of that?
Absolutely. Let's hear from Dave Leonard right now.
There are so many times in history that become very clear in your mind from what happened in any particular instance. November 22nd, 1963 is one of those days for me. I was in the third grade, had just returned from lunch recess, and the teacher was a little bit late, and she came in and announced that our beloved President Kennedy has been shot in Dallas, and there were no other details at the time. She started her lesson, and then shortly after that, the principal came in and explained that the school was going to be closed for the day and that we should go home. So I proceeded home thinking, okay, the president's been shot. I wonder what's going on. Got home, and my parents were already watching TV, and at that point he had been declared dead as an assassination. The thing that's so memorable about that weekend, because this was a Friday afternoon, was everybody just stayed glued to their black and white TV set. You didn't go anywhere. People would call our house to kind of say, did you hear about this, or are you aware of this latest update? And kind of the pre-Facebook kind of concept. But nevertheless, That was the standard. Now, my dad was a preacher at the time, and so in Sunday morning when he opened the doors for church, it was a packed house. Never with a crowd like that I had observed before, because people were just looking for some kind of direction at that point of what they should do, how should they cope. And that was a way for people to approach that. But November 22nd, 1963, definitely a date I'll never forget.
And that was, of course, our good friend Dave Leonard sharing some of his recollections of that tragic day. President Kennedy had been in office for 1,000 days, or just a little bit less than 3 years, and in his years as president, he projected youth and enthusiasm in his addresses, as we mentioned earlier, and in his actions. He had the Cold War to contend with, tension with the Soviet Union, climaxing in the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962. The beginning of the Civil Rights Movement began happening during his presidency. The fighting in a far-off country called Vietnam was intensifying, all along dealing with the full gamut of domestic and political issues he had to deal with. But President Kennedy was also enthusiastic about the space program. He encouraged effort and research into getting a man on the moon by the end of the decade. As we've discussed in previous editions of our show, the enthusiasm and positive attitude of that era were contagious. The president truly believed that we had the resources and the people to get the job done.
You know, and back to the political lines, have you ever read Profiles in Courage?
I have.
Talk about not only a history, but a biography account. Here's JFK before the presidency. The book Profiles in Courage, folks, I remember reading that in junior high school. And I didn't have a lot of political feelings at that time. When you're in junior high school, you have feelings for members of the opposite sex for the most part, and if you're going to get a trophy in Little League. But that stuck with me, Smitty, Profiles in Courage. And the reason it stuck with me because JFK wrote about senators who crossed party lines. Senators, be they on this side of the aisle or that side of the aisle, he wrote about the bravery and the integrity of 8 United States senators throughout the Senate's history.
Yes.
In a profile of the senators who crossed party lines or defied the opinion of their constituents to do what they felt was the right thing. And they suffered severe criticism and losses in popularity because of their beliefs and believing from their heart. And here is a guy who's not even the President of the United States being presidential in a book. And to this day, I got to get a chance to read that again.
Yeah.
But you look at the docudramas. We talked earlier in the show about his visit to Ireland. No one could figure out, his staff could not figure out, why would you want to go to Ireland? There's no political capital involved for you to go to Ireland. And his response is that's where my people are from and I want to go. That's the kind of guy he was. Even his adversaries had to tip their hat to him. He had his issues and the scandals and the hearsay and the secrets, and there will probably be more secrets to come out through history. The guy was just a man. And we're not trying to make him larger than life. We're looking back 50 years when this country was larger than life. It was a different country, like you say, Smitty.
Yeah.
But you go back to it, and Profiles of Courage is still one of the most popular read books on American political history ever written. And for good reason, too. You have a time in the 60s where you had a war looming. We were going to war. We were going to go to Vietnam. We already had people there, and it was only going to get worse. And we talked before the show, Smitty, about what if. This is kind of a what if show. It's a full cycle show, but it's a what if show, too. Had Kennedy remained in office, what would be the political and societal landscape today?
Exactly, Mike. I think about that often, and especially now that we're here at the 50th anniversary of his assassination. What would the world have been like if President Kennedy had lived? It's almost agonizing when you stop and think about that moment in Dallas. What would have happened if the shooter would have just missed? What if President Kennedy would have ducked down? What if the limo driver would have sped up? Just so many what ifs. What if President Kennedy had lived and served 2 terms? He would have been president until 1968. If he'd have won the second term, which I'm pretty sure that he would have won had he have had the chance to have run, but I've heard speculation in the past that the Vietnam War would not have escalated as much as it did. We'll never know the answer to that. The question of civil rights comes up. I think President Kennedy would have perhaps acted similarly as did his successor, President Johnson, in the area of civil rights. He had already begun to make inroads in the civil rights movement, assisting that. And the relations with the Soviet Union, which continued, the Cold War continued, of course, but I think that President Kennedy proved that he was more than capable in dealing during the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I think he showed Khrushchev and the Soviet leadership that he was somebody that would stand up to them and see them eye to eye and toe-to-toe, as it were.
Well, and he had an interesting crystal ball in his mind, too. He gave this speech, and it's one of the more popular speeches JFK gave in his lifetime, was by the end of this decade, we will have a man on the moon. We will have gone to the moon.
Yes.
He was dead on right.
He was.
NASA scrambled to make that into the decade timeline, but they made it happen. And you see now, 50 years later, NASA, unfortunately, is almost a dinosaur.
Exactly, which is very sad.
Very sad indeed. Some of the things Kennedy believed in, some of his philosophies, to this day are respected. And we're talking 50 years, a half a century ago. You're talking me as a 10-year-old kid, today as a 60-year-old senior who gets to get into the movie matinees for half price, which is a good thing. But speaking of the movie matinees, you know, that every time there's an anniversary, this is the 50th, you get a flurry of JFK documentaries that come back, hit the airwaves. JFK, the story of the man, still manages to sell tickets at the box office and keep people around the TV set at night.
He does. He most certainly does. He is still a very, very popular figure, Mike, not only in our American history, but also in our popular culture as well. Let's take another pause and listen to another one of the recollections from one of our friends recently. John Coleman of KUSI TV joined us, and he shared with us this recollection of that day in 1963.
I'll never forget the day when President Kennedy was assassinated. It was, of course, a tragic day for the nation and one of great sorrow. But it was also an amazing day for a young television announcer, me. I was working for a TV station in Omaha, Nebraska, KETV. I was about to do a women's game show that we had 30 women in the studio, and I was going to be the host of the show, and we were going to play games for half an hour starting at 1 o'clock. Well, the station was showing a rerun of My Little Margie, and I was sitting in the announcer's booth, a quiet spot, where I could prepare for the program that I was about to do, when a young woman who was the only one on duty in the newsroom came running through the control room and up to the announcer's booth and said, "Mr. Coleman, look at this." And it was the flash from AP that said, "President Kennedy has been shot in Dallas, Texas." I waved to the operator of the station who was playing the My Little Margie show and went on the intercom and yelled, "Get me a news bulletin slide. I'm going on the air." And he looked at me and shook his head, but he knew he had to do it, so he put up the slide and cut to my mic. And I said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt this program for a flash bulletin from the Associated Press. The dateline is Dallas, Texas," and I read it exactly as written. "President John F. Kennedy has been shot." That's all I have, ladies and gentlemen. That's it. But wait a minute. I see a messenger from our newsroom bringing another AP dispatch at this moment. And the dispatch said, "The President and Mrs. Kennedy have been taken to a hospital by ambulance. No word yet on the President's condition. No word on who shot him or why." The President was there for a parade. So I read that, and I went back to the original bulletin. And then I threw back to My Little Margie. And I said to the man in the control room, I've got to do something more. I'm going to go get in front of a camera." And I headed for the studio, and the producer of the game show I was about to do stopped me, and he said, "John, don't mess stuff up here now. We're going on the air at 1 o'clock with this program." I said, "No, we're not. Something has just happened that our program is canceled." He said, "You can't cancel the program." I said, "I just did." "Well, I'm just a kid announcer." But I did it. And I sat in front of, and now these 30 women are sitting there waiting for this fun time on TV. They haven't heard anything that's happened. And the camera's turned and pointed at me at the desk, and I sit at the news desk in the same studio a few feet from them. And I waved to put me on again as the young woman arrives from the newsroom with a follow-up from the AP. And I come on camera and I said, ladies and gentlemen, we are interrupting all programming now. The balance of My Little Margie will not be seen. We will be switching to the ABC network as soon as it is feeding from Dallas or New York or Washington. Stand by. In the meantime, I will repeat the bulletin. And I repeated what I had, and then she kept bringing me more detail. And finally, at about 20 after 1, I said, ladies and gentlemen, I have now received the bulletin that we have been dreading. It has been announced at Parkland Hospital in Dallas, Texas, that the president is dead. I'll repeat, President John F. Kennedy is dead. We don't believe that anyone else was shot. We believe that the shooter has been arrested, but we don't know anything more. I am monitoring all sources and do not have anything more than this at this time. The president was there for this special ceremony this weekend, and I got some background then from the young woman in the newsroom and began to give it. Lyndon Johnson is also there. Air Force One is at the airport. We believe that the vice president is fine, but he will now be the president. And eventually, at about 1:30, almost a full hour after this bulletin had broken, I got a gesture from the control room, and then I heard in my ear, the network is coming on from New York. And I said, this concludes our coverage using Associated Press from Omaha. We now switch to the ABC network. And then I just virtually collapsed. I mean, what a thing to do. What I had been through, and I'd had to keep my own emotions under check as best I could. And these women are sobbing in the studio there across from me. The producer of that program is going crazy because we didn't do the show. I'm feeling great pressure. And then we sat and we watched the ABC coverage. Well, it took a long time for them to get a signal up from Dallas. In those days, there were no quick satellite feeds or internet feeds or something. To get a picture from Dallas required to New York and out to the nation required switching of hundreds of microwave relay stations across the country. Eventually, we got the picture from Dallas, and we saw, but the Magruder film wasn't available yet or anything. We saw the coverage. And we stayed with it all night long, and we all stayed there, and I kept doing the local breaks. We would cut to Omaha reaction, a statement by the mayor, a statement by our congressman, a statement by our governor. And they would come to our studio, and we would put them on. And the next morning, we cut to a special church service, memorializing the death of the president. And we were only 10 minutes into it when Ruby shot Oswald, and we cut away again back to Dallas, and then stayed with the coverage right through the funeral procession in Washington and everything that followed. And of course, saw the new president, Lyndon Johnson, being sworn in. It was an amazing event in old-fashioned television reporting.
Well, Smitty, remember when John Coleman was here doing the show and we asked him to share with us? Now, John is pretty close to being 80 years old, and he was wispy-eyed when he shared with us. And you could tell his recollection was almost like mine. It was almost like it was yesterday. And John was in a very interesting, as he said in his recollection, he was in an interesting position. He was right there at Communications Central at his station, and we talk about technology in this show. You know, Smitty, you would think that a story about a national tragedy today that happens, how fast it's in the ears and the eyes of not only the American public, but the world public, and how long it took that story of that horrible day in Dallas, Texas, to propagate throughout the country, because it was bits and pieces. It was a total jigsaw puzzle to where you had correspondents sitting at the end of the wire reading the AP wire as it spit the paper out in real time, and how the technology has changed now. And I think part of that 50 years ago, I think that's part of what really sent the chills up your spine, is because you didn't know a whole lot more than the guy who was reading the account to you of what was going on at Parkland Hospital.
Hospital, yes. No, you're right, Mike. And it seems to me in the radio, and I've studied the radio and television coverage of that day, it was a good 20 minutes from the time that he was shot to having the first bulletins come out. It wasn't instantaneous. You know, today we're used to something happens in a city where they have a satellite truck up in maybe 5-10 minutes. This is a good half hour before word began to be getting out. And you've got to remember, there was no satellite. All the news moved by hardwire, by reporters using a payphone calling in. Television was done by microwave relay, and the telephone company was involved.
You had no rewrite guy.
No.
You had no verification. How it came off the wire was how you read it, and you hoped you got to read it before the competitor down the street got it on the air.
Exactly right. That event, the assassination of President Kennedy and subsequently the shooting of Oswald and the coverage of the funeral on the following Monday, has been stated as the time when television journalism came into being. Television news grew up very quickly that weekend. Radio covered it, of course, as we mentioned at the beginning of our show, with a little bit more mobility, but radio also offered extensive coverage. Both radio and television canceled all of their regular programming. They canceled all commercials, and it was nothing but exclusive coverage of this tragedy.
And even the TV coverage, Smitty, I remember in a journalism class, the professor saying, and you nailed it right there, buddy, when you said about the graduation, a lot of professors believe that that's when television news breaking coverage graduated, and in my case, the professor said graduated from high school to undergraduate work. It was a big leap because that's where breaking news really took shape and form on the television medium. On radio, you could go back to the Hindenburg.
Absolutely.
Was radio coverage. And radio, it was theater of the mind. You had to put a lot of the pictures together in your mind to know what was going on, because all you had was a guy telling you what he saw going on, and the rest was up to you. Television, where they had that first news crew, and you've seen the documentaries there at the hospital, at the ramp where the ambulance was, and the motorcycle police officers and the detectives and the Secret Service, just a chaotic bunch, a mob of people running in and out. You felt like you were in the moment, and that was not commonplace up to that day in American television news reportage. You would have a missile liftoff, but the urgency and the mystique, the mystery. So that brought us to even today, where everybody's a journalist, everybody's got a smartphone in their hand. If there's a dreadful wreck down the street at the corner, it's going to be on the news tonight, not because a network got their truck out there, but because somebody was talking to their significant other on the phone and saw this thing happen. The point is, we'll never see those days again, where we're sitting there wondering and praying and guessing.
This is a whole time period when, again, as we said, it took a long time to disseminate the information. The television networks, I know, as we mentioned earlier at the beginning of our show, NBC and ABC had tremendous trouble getting the story on the air. ABC didn't even have a studio set up. They had to, you could see the stagehand pulling curtains back, just doing a makeshift studio. Over on NBC, they couldn't patch a telephone call through. As one of the NBC News anchors, Bill Ryan, I believe it was, said it was just a time of controlled panic.
Well, you had Walter Cronkite, the man himself at CBS, with his thick horn-rimmed glasses. In that moment where Cronkite takes his glasses off, and he's holding back the tears, but as a professional, he's got to report what's about to come next. And I remember that very moment. I almost knew what he was about to say. Wow. And that stunned the nation, that it came from a newsman, Walter Cronkite, that the president, in fact, had died. And to get the story and to get the pieces of the story and to put them together. Now, you had your news staffs and news broadcasts. The evening news was really in its infancy. Everybody in the news business at that time of day was trying to get ready for the evening news.
Absolutely, yes.
And a lot of guys were off, and a lot of the producers were at the 3 martini lunches, and it was like the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Right.
Unexpected. At the worst possible time to get it reported, and so everybody scrambled, they put it together. By the next day, of course, the story, as horrible and tragic as it was, started to make sense of what had happened.
That's exactly right, Mike. It was just something that caught everybody off guard. I believe I read later on, or I heard an interview with Walter Cronkite where he acknowledged that moment when he became emotional and he thought to himself that he had to almost put his emotions aside, park them, and his job was to deliver news. He knew he had to deliver the news because an anxious country was waiting to hear what had happened.
And even the disc jockeys, the DJ, the top 40 guys, they were in the middle middle of an air shift, trying to get afternoon traffic going, or getting their music shift, lining up their playlist, working the program director. Actually, we're going to hear from a guy who was in Top 40 Radio. I don't know if he was on the air that day, but our good friend Jack Vincent, who we know as the grandfather and the godfather of Top 40 AM radio from his days at KCBQ. Jack had some interesting recollections of that day in November 1963.
On that day that President Kennedy was killed, I was at my doctor's office, Dr. Tracy's, and when they said the stock market had shut down for the day, I said the president is dead, because they wouldn't have shut the stock market down had he not died. And everybody in the office kind of agreed with me. And then a little bit later on, they come out and said that the president was dead from the shots that occurred in Dallas.
And you had a very unusual night at KCBQ that night, the music that you played.
Yeah, we switched from rock and roll music to a classical format, and that went on for almost 2 weeks, I think. And it was so different from what we were used to, but I guess everybody in the country went for the same format of classical music, and I think it was a great tribute to the president. Everybody was in a very gracious mood and thought we were doing the right thing.
Yeah, imagine working in radio that day in 1963, and things are going good, and you're planning to get off shift, go to dinner, and your entire world, and your career for that matter, changes on a piece of teletype paper coming off of a machine. We talk about the movies that have been made, the conspiracy-related movies, the docudramas. Of course, JFK, the movie produced by Oliver Stone, is probably one of the most poignant, whether you agree with the treatment offered by the movie or not. But there was a lot going on in the background for the months and years to come after the JFK assassination. And because of that, movies, documentaries, docudramas, if you subscribe to Netflix or Apple TV, you can, at any given time, you can go to Netflix and you can download a dozen documentaries relating not only to the Kennedy years, but to the Kennedy presidency and the Kennedy assassination and the Kennedy conspiracy. You could have a weekend Kennedy TV-a-thon and probably end up more confused than when you started watching them. But I don't think the movies and the documentaries are ever going to quit, Smitty. I would like to invite the folks out there listening, grab a documentary and look how news reporting, as you can tell, Smitty and I are slanted in these shows toward broadcasting, because that's what we do. We're TV and radio guys. But the work that's involved, not only putting a show together like Galaxy, but imagine putting a world-breaking event, a presidential assassination or an earthquake or a flood or a horrible, dreadful airliner crash. The work that goes into that, grab one of these black and white documentaries, and where so much footage was assembled to create a linear story, and it'll amaze you what you come up with. Because you look at JFK, the movie by Oliver Stone, this is mega millions of dollars to go into production of this with big-name movie stars, Kevin Costner, Tommy Lee Jones, Joe Pesci, but it was a conspiracy movie. It was not a movie about the assassination. It was about the eerie, creepy circumstances prior to and shortly after the JFK assassination. You could get a number of conspiracy-related movies. I think it was called Executive Action. That movie actually was written and produced by Dalton Trumbo, the famous screenwriter, and actually it was pulled, and we can only think it was pulled from the American theaters because it was probably more accurate than anything we've seen. But to get a good history lesson on America in a different time, in a different place, with different leadership, a different government, with different people, and a different society, get a few of these JFK, Kennedy assassination-related documentaries and take a look through. And if you didn't live in that time like I was fortunate enough to do, it'll bring you back to a time and you'll be able to get a little clearer understanding of what we're talking about here.
Absolutely, Mike. And we're not going to get into the variety of conspiracy theories because there are too many, and a lot of them are just conjecture. And, of course, they run the gamut from the government being involved to the mafia being involved to the Cubans being involved to all kinds of things. And that will eventually come to light, or it may not come to light. It may be a mystery from now until the end of time. But it is very interesting that so many of these motion pictures deal with that kind of a situation, not from a historical point, but more from a conspiracy theory point of view. Well, we've heard from a number of our friends who remember that day, and we're going to go now to another one of our friends who was with us recently. Our good friend Shotgun Tom Kelly remembers that November 22nd, 1963.
I think if you ask anybody, they always know where they were when President Kennedy was shot. And I was in 8th grade at St. John of the Cross Catholic School in Lemon Grove. I remember there was a combination 8th grade, 2 8th grade classes because the classes were so big. And the nuns were the Sisters of St. Joseph of Orange. And when they found out it came over the news, I even remember the station because I was into radio in those days, as I am now. And it was Kogo Radio. They wheeled an old antique radio over from the convent so both classrooms could hear the reports on Kogo Radio coming over NBC about what was going on in Dallas. We'll never, ever forget that day, and remember the sisters rolling that antique radio over so we could hear. The rest of the day on the radio was just no rock and roll at all. Just really nice, soothing music on every station, music station that is. And if it was a news station, they had continuing reports. But that is my recollection of the day when we had the report that President John F. Kennedy got shot in Dallas.
Our good friend Shotgun Tom Kelly recalling the events that he recalls on that Friday, the 22nd of November, 1963. Well, Mike, as we get ready to wrap up this 50th anniversary look back at the day that President Kennedy was killed, we have to ask ourselves how and why is the assassination of President Kennedy still of such fascination today? You know, I read somewhere that people always remember November 22nd, 1963, but very few people remember what date President Kennedy was born. His death has overshadowed a lot of the facts of his life. And it's interesting that his death is still in such forefront today. The interest has never waned even to newer generations.
And probably a lot of that plays into the fact that he was an American icon, a political icon, a pop culture icon. We talked about the young, energetic, dashing man with the beautiful family, the beautiful wife, the very wealthy parents, the powerful family structure. And I think a lot of that, Smitty, will fast forward up to today. You can go into thrift stores, antique shops, you can go to estate sales, and you will find a JFK plate or commemorative spoon, or in some cases, as you will see if you go on eBay and type up JFK, thousands of items. You can see that newspapers were kept by people on that day. The headline the day after, JFK slain in Dallas, JFK shot, JFK dead. Our good friend Jeff Prescott talks about the millions of copies of newspapers still buried in scrapbooks. The headline page, Section A, still in scrapbooks, still in boxes in garages, still in old trunks. I find them. Jeff goes out, and we found a couple 2 months ago up at a flea market in Pasadena. And we're not going to take the story and make it a collector's corner, but I'm going to tell you that my 24-year-old daughter and I were together working to furnish her new apartment, and we went to a couple of consignment shops along the way. And there were the colorful plates, the commemorative plates. One was of JFK, and the other one was of Martin Luther King. They were in the same lot. And my daughter asked, "You sure see a lot of those guys on stuff." She really didn't know who they were, but the eye contact. And who was Kennedy? And when I explained to somebody in a younger generation, they've heard of him, don't know a lot about him, but to this day, their parents and their grandparents vividly remember, such as like I do at the age of 10 that day. And as long as those stories can be carried down generation over generation, I think the Kennedy mystique will remain alive and actually attractive and exciting to the American listeners and viewers, because it's a crime. In my opinion, it's never been solved. It was a legend in American political history. Very few young people really take this government seriously, unfortunately, now. And they're reaching back. They're reaching back for roots. Was it always like this? No, it wasn't. It was a different place, a different time, with different leadership, with different people. And I think that's the fulcrum. I think that's the wheelhouse of the JFK mystique, Smitty.
Very well phrased, Mike. And in my case, I look at film, I look at videotape, I hear sound recordings of President Kennedy, and I look at him, and I look at the way that he conducted himself, his mannerisms, how he spoke, what he said. And again, as you said earlier, Mike, we're not making him larger than life. We're looking back accurately and objectively at what he was and what he represented. And I look back at that and I say that he looks presidential. He looks like someone who is representing America, someone who is an American, someone who shows what America is all about. Vigor, youth, vitality, positive thinking, love for his country. And I think that maybe perhaps some of the younger people today do see that, and perhaps they'll watch a documentary on President Kennedy. Perhaps they'll hear a sound recording of him, his inaugural address, for example, and they'll want to learn more about President Kennedy. And I think as the years go on, Mike, another 50 years, 100 years from now, the interest will still be just as strong as it is today. They'll look back 100 years ago, President Kennedy was assassinated, and who was this man, and let's learn about him.
Absolutely, and we do give respect, and we pay respect to historical figures, events, things, and we do invite the input of our listeners. This is one of the more serious, important stories we've done, but we go all over the board, and we are so glad that you sat with us and listened in over the last hour here. You are listening to Galaxy Moonbeam Night Site, and we do have to wrap up this show until next time, but we do welcome you back. I'm Mike.
I'm Smitty.
And join us again. You can contact us at Galaxy Moonbeam Night Site at gmail.com. Galaxy Moonbeam Night Site, that's SITE at gmail.com. Become a friend on our Facebook page. You're welcome to join us and involve yourself in our family of Galaxy good guys and good gals. We are at Galaxy Moonbeam Night Site on Facebook. You can check out our website, galaxymoonbeamnightsite.com. We can't tell you how much that this means to us and energizes us and keeps us motivated to be able to share these memories. And we hope by doing so we stimulate memories of you and your family and friends.
Those of us who remember and those of us who want to remember is our way of sharing our thoughts of that day and of remembering President Kennedy. And it is a melancholy opportunity, but we do want to honor him and remember him on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of his passing. Ladies and gentlemen, we thank you so much for joining us, and we do look forward to having you with us again on the next episode of Galaxy Moonbeam Night Site.
Take care and bye-bye.
This is the Galaxy Nostalgia Network.